We're in 2 Corinthians. The year is fast coming to a close, and we are fast coming to the end of our study of these letters to Corinth. And we are in chapter 12 of 2 Corinthians. We noticed here as Paul is answering his critics and defending himself to this church and to these Judaizing teachers, that back in chapter 11, verse 16, he started what many call his fool speech, where he has to actually go through his credentials and compare himself to these teachers and what he's done for the Lord and for these people in particular. And the first thing he does is go through, beginning in verse 26, he first mentions his physical heritage, his Jewish background. And that tells us right there that he's probably dealing with some Judaizing teachers there in Corinth that are criticizing him. He then goes through all the sufferings, all the trials, physical trials that he had been through on behalf of the church in general and for the cause of Christ. Things that these people could not match, whatever they were boasting about that they had done. They couldn't match what Paul had done for the kingdom. And then he mentions even his mental anxiety and concerns for all the churches as you get down there about verse 28 of chapter 11. He then even gives us a specific instance which we know a little bit from the book of Acts when he escaped the city of Damascus and the kinds of persecutions that he had to endure. And then in chapter 12 he starts out, and we just finished, we're finishing this up, and we ended last week, this little section on this vision that he had that took him into, as he calls it, the third heaven or paradise, to hear words that are inexpressible, things that aren't allowed to be repeated. And I guarantee you none of these fellows that were criticizing him had ever had this kind of experience. Now, he starts out talking in the third person, and we're not really sure why. There's several speculations as to why he did that. One could be for dramatic effect, but more likely because Paul found this, what he was having to do, he found so distasteful that he was having to more or less boast about his accomplishments that he actually starts talking about, he knows a guy. You ever heard everybody say, I know a guy? Well, Paul says, I know a guy. And the guy did this. Well, the guy he's talking about is him. And we start seeing that as you get into verse 5. Of such a one I will boast, yet of myself I will not boast, except, of course, in my weaknesses. And that's the way it's always been. And we've talked about that before, and we'll continue to talk about how God works through the weak and powerless to show His power rather than those that are considered to be something in this world. And so it may be, and so why does he talk? And we know it's him for sure when you get to verse 7. Unless I should be exalted above measure by the abundance of the revelation. So that I don't get the big head from what I experienced, this is what I'm having to deal with. And we're getting ready to start that section. So we know it's him. So did he talk in third person for dramatic effect? I don't know. I doubt it. Did he talk in third person because maybe some have speculated because what he's saying is, look, I'm not the same person I was 14 years ago when this happened. And maybe that's one explanation. But I think the most likely explanation is it's just out of humility. Paul was a very humble person. He didn't want to, as the word is used here, boast about his accomplishments on behalf of the Lord. And so that's why he does it in this particular instance. But we left off there, I believe, about verse 6, where he says, for though I might desire to boast, I will not be a fool, or I'll not be foolish, for I will speak the truth, but I refrain lest anyone should think of me above what he sees me to be or hears from me. Paul, why had you not relayed this experience to these people before now? Why has 14 years gone by before you related this experience to these people? He's only doing it now out of necessity, right? He's only doing it now because of his critics. And so more than likely, had these Corinthians, these false teachers, and then the church in general not given him such a hassle, he probably would have never brought this up, or the Holy Spirit would have never inspired him to bring this up at all. Because he says, what? I would rather you what? What does he say? But I refrain lest anyone should think of me above what he sees me to be or hears from me. What do I want you to base your estimate of me on? Frankly, what should we want anybody to base their estimate of us on? What they see, what they hear from me, and what they see me do. I mean, these people couldn't verify what had happened 14 years ago anyway, and he certainly didn't want to use it, some kind of boastful thing. Oh, look at me. All I want you to know is you make your decision about me, about who I am and what you think I'm about, and whether you should trust me based on what you've seen in me, what you've heard from me. Base it on personal experience. That's all I want. And so that's why he had not mentioned it before, but he has to now because he's defending himself. So, we get back to this theme of weakness and power as they interact with Bible characters. We know that Paul's physical appearance, from things earlier said, probably wasn't that overwhelming for people. Even his speech, he received some criticism for. And of course, people, base their opinions a lot on other people by first impressions, and those things are hard to overcome. But he says, look, I was given this great opportunity, this vision, caught up in the third heaven or paradise. Now notice verse 7. And lest I should be exalted above measure by the abundance of the revelations, a thorn in the flesh was given to me, a messenger of Satan to buffet me, lest I be exalted above measure. Concerning this thing I pleaded with the Lord 3 times that it might depart from me, and he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you. For my strength is made perfect or complete in weakness. Therefore, most gladly I will rather boast in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. Therefore, I take pleasure in infirmities, in reproaches, in needs, in persecutions, in distresses for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then I am strong. Well, so he gets this thorn in the flesh. That Greek word there for thorn, I don't know how you say it. Skolops literally means something pointed. At one time it meant a stake in classical Greek, but by this time it meant a splinter or thorn. And so he says it was given to him in the flesh. So that tells me what? People have speculated about what this is. But one thing I do know, if it's a thorn in the flesh, what does that mean? It's a physical problem. Some have speculated it's a mental issue, it's stress. No. It says it's in the flesh. So he's got some physical issue that he has to deal with on a daily basis, just like most of us, right? And that was given to him in order to basically, as we would say, keep his feet on the ground after, all this stuff that God has given him and done for him. And very likely, from the context, we might even conclude, although, we wouldn't get in an argument about it, but very likely he didn't have it. Say at the time he was converted, but he got it when? It would seem to me from this context. This problem arose perhaps about the same time he received the revelation. I'm going to show you all this, and you're going to get to hear this, but hey, now you get to deal with this. So, Paul still had a lot to learn, of course, after his conversion about submission to Christ and humility. And so very likely during that time he spent in Tarsus before Barnabas went and got him. If you go back the 14 years perhaps, he received this revelation. He also received this thorn in the flesh to keep him from thinking what? Okay, I've gotten this revelation perhaps that nobody else has ever gotten one like this, not even the other apostles. So what might I think if I'm Paul? Yeah, I mean, I'm superior to them. You know, I've moved beyond them in the pecking order. No, Christ says, you haven't. And so then the question becomes, well, what is it? And there's all kinds of speculation on that. Generally, most commentators come down on the idea of what? Although we can't prove this, but what? Yeah, maybe poor eyesight. We get that from some of the statements that he made, especially in Galatians. Chapter 6, he says, "See with what large letters I am writing to you with my own hand." We also know that most of Paul's letters that were written to these churches were written by who? Actually written by who? Yeah, by what we call secretaries or amanuensis. And so Paul would dictate them, and then he would sign them, and then he would make statements like, "See, I've signed it with my own hand." So maybe indicating maybe he had an issue with writing because of his eyesight. I don't know. And then he, says he writes with large letters. So some believe the evidence suggests some physical problem with his eyes. And if it's not that, we don't know what it is. Some have speculated, I saw some speculated malaria, but what that ends up being is malaria then that caused, his vision problem. Yeah.
Who was it that he said you would have plucked out your own eye?
Yeah, that's right. And he talked about, let's see, who was he writing to? Was that the Galatians also? Or the Corinthians? Who knows? Who did he say? What letter did he say? You would have plucked your own eyes out for me if you could. That's another passage that some feel indicates that, yeah, he had an eye problem, a problem with his vision. And so, whatever it is, he's got this physical ailment. Like all people, he has to deal with it on a regular basis. And he calls it, he refers to a messenger of Satan to buffet me. That word buffet in the Greek means, comes from a noun that means knuckles or closed fist, so literally to strike with the fist. Some of the more modern translations, because he's talking about a thorn, you don't really get smacked with a thorn, and so some use the word torment here, a thorn in the flesh to torment me. The New King James says buffet. I think the NIV and some others say torment. Why would he say Satan? It came from Satan. Why would he say that?
Just like saying Antichrist. These people that oppose what he's doing actually hurt him. They physically hurt him.
Yeah, but I mean, he's talking about his thorn in the flesh. Came from Satan, and we know Satan's not a god. This is not a world in which we live where evil and good and evil are equal. God is all powerful, so Satan's a created being like we are. So in that sense, Satan can't do anything that God doesn't allow him to.
Greg, the verse is Galatians 4:15.
Oh, Galatians 4:15 about the plucking out the eyes. So that's in Galatians also. What'd you say?
I was on the mindset that God does not send bad things to good people. And that basically lines up to be the same thing. The devil is responsible. It's not God that's responsible for his problem. So therefore he gives the devil credit.
Well, let me ask you this. If we didn't live in a world smitten by sin, would anybody have a thorn in the flesh? No. No. Wouldn't be such a thing, right? And God doesn't do bad things to people, but certainly God allows us to be tested in this world in which we live. I mean, ask Job about it. Who caused Job's problems? Satan did, but Job didn't know that. Whole time Job didn't know that. He thought God was doing it to him. Well, God allowed it. But Satan has his limits, certainly. He can only do what's permitted. And as somebody once said, he keeps him on a short leash. But whatever power Satan has in this world has been made possible by our own sin. That's the power he holds over us. And so, bad things happen in this world because, when you want to get right down to it, it's the sinful world, the nature in which we live. This veil of soul making, as some philosophers have called it, this proving ground that we live in. We all have to deal with these things. And so, it's interesting, though, Paul didn't resign himself to this thorn, did he? He didn't say, oh, well, I guess I'll have to deal with it. What did he do? Verse 8. Well, I pleaded with the Lord 3 times that it would depart from me. Now, we don't know why it was just 3 times. I guess at some point, that's when God said, maybe after the 3rd time, what? My grace is sufficient for you. My strength is made perfect in weakness. Deal with it. God tells Paul, deal with it. And how does he tell Paul to deal with it? What does he mean by that? My grace is sufficient for you. Paul, deal with it. How are you going to deal with it, Paul? How are any of us going to deal with our problems in this world? We're going to trust in God, right? We're going to take our problems to Him. We're going to leave them with Him. And whatever happens, Job said, I think chapter 13, maybe about verse 9. Alan probably knows. Job said, though he slay me, what? Though he slay me, I will trust in Him. Job said, I don't know why this is happening to me, but whatever comes my way, good, bad, indifferent, I'm going to trust Him. What does Proverbs say? Yeah. But Job says, he could kill me, and I'd still say, hey, you know what's best for me. And so God says, my grace is sufficient for you. You can rely upon me to get you through this. And part of your greatness will be that you're bearing of this thorn. This is going to keep you from taking a too high of a view of yourself, but my strength is made perfect in weakness. And then Paul would say, therefore, most gladly, I'd rather boast in my infirmities that the power of Christ may rest upon me. In other words, whatever glorying I do, all of my accomplishments, the glory and the praise doesn't belong to me, it belongs to who? To God, to Christ. And that's what God wants. That's why He uses people, what we would call people of little standing, or maybe with whatever weaknesses or problems we have. That's what He wants to use, because that's when He is glorified the most. Not by using people of high standing or great ability or whatever it might be.
That verse in Job 13 was verse 15.
Verse 15. Well, I don't know where I came up with 9. Paul was always anxious for Christ to receive the praise, not him. It's all about giving Him the glory, and God can use our weaknesses. And that's the way it's always been throughout the Bible, right? I mean, we mentioned this last week. The nation of Israel, God said, look, when they were rebelling against Him and He was writing to them from the prophets, He would say, look, you were nothing. You were nothing. Of all people in the world, you were nothing. And I took you, and I made you my wife, and I used you for the good of the rest of the world, to bring my Son into this world. That was the purpose, your purpose. And God could have used The great nations. He didn't use Assyria or Babylon or Rome or Greece, Egypt. He didn't use any. When His Son came into the world, the very member of the Godhead who created the entire universe, Hebrews says, Hebrews chapter 1 and John chapter 1. The reason this world continues to spin on a daily basis is just because simply Jesus Christ wants it to. It's the only reason this universe goes on. And the very one who created the universe, when He came here, came as what? A poor person. He had nothing. Literally nothing other than the clothes on His back. He said the foxes have holes, the birds of the air have nests. The Son of Man has nowhere to lay His head. He owned the whole world and He had nothing when He lived here. That's how He works. He's glorified in weaknesses. So, it's interesting here, he says, therefore I take pleasure in infirmities and reproaches. Reproaches is, some translations there say insults, good translation. Insults, needs, persecutions, distresses for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then I am strong. Now Paul is not saying, don't. 1 Corinthians says, chapter 7, self-denial is okay for a short period of time. But if you go into 1 Timothy 4:3, Paul basically says, look, being an ascetic doesn't really have much spiritual value. Okay? You want to deprive yourself, of food and drink and all that, come across as somebody real spiritual, that's fine, but it's really not. He says in 1 Timothy, they have a show of wisdom, but they're really not all that effective. So he's not talking about asceticism here. But what he's saying is, these critics of his in Corinth, these false teachers, they were in the business of self-exaltation. And Paul's just drawing a sharp contrast between himself and these guys. And so if Christ is going to be glorified in weaknesses, then Paul says, hey, I'm overjoyed to take part in weaknesses and insults and persecutions or whatever comes my way. Again, one of these great paradoxes we see in Christianity, up is down, weakness is strength. Because it wasn't like the strength that the people in the Roman Empire admired. What kind of strength did the people of that day admire? What kind of strength do people in our day admire? Yeah, actually physical strength. Whether it's through, a conquering army or some conquering athletic team or whatever it is, or whether it's even a big successful businessman or whatever it might be. We're big on achievement in this physical world. But most people in this world have a very short view of what this life's about. And so it's just the way it's always been in the history of God's people. The righteous sufferer brings honor and glory to God that he relies on. And so Job did it. Jesus did it. Paul says, I'm just following his example. Well, it's interesting. If you go back to chapter 11, verse 16, when he started what's called this fool speech, he said, let no one think me a fool, if otherwise I at least receive me as a fool, that I may boast a little. He kind of ends it the same way. Here we are in verse 11, and he ends this speech the same way, calling attention to the foolishness of his self-commendation. I have become a fool in boasting. You have compelled me. I didn't want to get involved in this, but because you wouldn't defend me to these guys, you Corinthians, and you should have, you can just hear the irritation, and we'll see some sarcasm in this next section that he has. For I ought to have been commended by you, of all people. I came here and established this church. I brought you the gospel. You should have been defending me. For in nothing was I behind the most eminent apostles, though I am nothing. Truly the signs of an apostle. Now we're going to get to signs. We've seen visions, now signs. The signs of an apostle, miracles, were accomplished among you with all perseverance in signs and wonders and mighty deeds. For what is it in which you were inferior to other churches, except I myself was not burdensome to you? Forgive me this wrong. Now that's sarcastic. He uses this term again, eminent apostles. We saw that back in chapter 11. I'm not behind the most eminent apostles. And again, commentators are split on whether he's being sarcastic or serious here. Because he could be saying, these false teachers that have come into Corinth and that are holding themselves up as something great, maybe even apostles, he's saying, well, I'm not behind any of the most, eminent apostles. Or he could be serious and saying, look, even of the real apostles, the 12, the ones that were with Christ, I was one born out of due season. I'm not behind any of them, by the way. So either way, it works. And again, I think he's being sarcastic, probably what his critics were saying, but though I'm a nobody. Well, that's probably what they were saying. I'm a nobody. Or he could be serious and again saying, well, that's his self-assessment in the eyes of Christ. But of course, miracles were expected to accompany apostolic preaching, right? Jesus used miracles to confirm who he was and that he was from God. The apostles could perform them, and other first century prophets could perform them to prove that the message they were preaching was from God. It was expected of an apostle to confirm his message and that he was from God. So, Paul says, look, I pretty much think that what I did was sufficient to prove to you who I am and that you should have come to my defense. For with all perseverance, signs, wonders, mighty deeds. What's the difference in those three words? Signs, wonders, and mighty deeds. We've talked about it before.
Signs, the purpose, wonders, reaction.
Yeah.
Deed.
That's the actual event or the work, yeah. It's just three ways of saying the same, describing the same thing. The sign is the purpose of a miracle. To call it a wonder is the reaction that it causes on the part of the people that see it. And then it is a miracle or a mighty deed. That's the act itself. But it's three words describing the same thing from different perspectives. So he performed all of these things. And he says, I did the same thing while I was there that I did with other churches. So what is it that made you inferior to others? Well, again, he's responding to this same criticism that his adversaries were saying. He's insulted you by not taking what? By not taking money from you. And again, it's a catch-22 for Paul. If he takes money from them, the critics will say what? You're just doing it for the money. And then if he doesn't take money from them and he works with his own hands, as Acts said he did, he was making tents with Aquila and Priscilla until the brethren from Macedonia, Philippi, came with support for him. And then Acts says he went into preaching full time and he quit making tents. So he didn't take money from them. So if I take money, you say I'm doing it for the money. If I don't take money, basically I've insulted you. Plus, maybe he's not a real apostle, because if he was a real apostle and he really had authority, he'd take the money like the rest of them. So he's in a tough spot either way. Yeah.
In the denominations today, it's very popular for people to get up and give testimonials about what God's doing and all this. They give testimonials. And they say, I've talked to people, they say, well, Paul gave a testimonial, and even Job gave a testimonial. But it was God that testified for Job, really, when you look at the book. And in the end, God shows up and God speaks and straightens it all out. This is what's going on. And then God used Job. Now, Paul, he's not giving his testimonial. It's God that's giving it. And
Well-
when he said, I have this thorn, who shows up to straighten that all out? Christ. Christ personally spoke and said, your weakness is going to show my power. So God's given the testimony for what he's doing and how he's using Paul. And Paul's just relaying that to us. People today think that they could speak for God.
Yeah, I mean, given,
Speculate.
testifying to some, experience that you've had in order to convert people is not what Paul is doing.
Right.
Paul's simply defending himself. And even in the book of Acts, when he relayed his conversion 3 times, he did that under what well, he didn't relay it the first time. It was just told to us what happened. But the next 2 times when he relayed his conversion, what were the circumstances of him relaying his conversion? He was on trial. Yeah, he was on trial. Again, each time he was giving a defense, not some kind of, not testifying in order to get people to come to Christ because of some experience that he had. And of course, he gets really sarcastic here. He said, look, what was it you were inferior to? You received every piece of knowledge that you could receive from an apostle, just like any other church I went to, or any other churches that other apostles went to across the Roman Empire. You got everything, the same thing everybody else did. You didn't get anything less other than I wasn't a burden to you. I didn't take your money. Oh, I'm sorry. Forgive me of this wrong. I mean, that's just sarcasm. I'm sorry, I didn't take your money. And he gets even more personal here. You know, when it comes to these Christ and the apostles and their teaching, teaching is a personal thing. I mean, they needed, trust on the part. And so he asks several rhetorical questions here in this next section. Again, pointing out, that they're not thinking the right way, beginning in verse 14. Now, for the 3rd time, I am ready to come to you, and I will not be burdensome to you, for I do not seek yours, but you. For the children ought not to lay up for the parents, but the parents for the children, and I will very gladly spend and be spent for your souls, though the more abundantly I love you, the less I am loved. That's actually translated a little differently in some versions. It's more of a question. Though the more abundantly I love you, the less you love me. Be that as it may, I did not burden you. Nevertheless, being crafty, now again, this is what they were accusing him of. Being crafty, I caught you by cunning. Did I take advantage of you by any of those whom I sent to you? I urged Titus and sent our brother with him. Did Titus take advantage of you? Did we not walk in the same spirit? Did we not walk in the same steps? Notice all these rhetorical questions. It's interesting, he says here in verse 14, for the 3rd time. Now that can be interpreted 2 different ways. Legitimately. Now for the 3rd time I am ready to come to you. Some say, now here for the 3rd time I'm ready to come to you. That could mean either one, I'm coming to you for the 3rd time, or it could mean this is the 3rd time I've tried to come to you, that I've been trying to get ready to come to you, and this is the 3rd time I'm trying to get ready. Whatever. And that may depend on how many letters to the Corinthians you think are written. I don't think there were 4. I think there were 3. If you think there were 4, then you probably have to go with this is the 3rd time. But they're accusing him again about this whole money situation. And it makes you wonder, and you get the sense, okay, Paul didn't take money payment from them, but now he's going around the Gentile world doing what? He's collecting money, but not for himself, right? He's collecting money. He's gathering this big collection, according to the book of Acts and the Corinthian letters and other letters in the New Testament. He's collecting this money for the poor saints in Judea, right? So, you wouldn't take money, I'm speaking like one of his detractors. He wouldn't take pay, but look, he's taking up this big collection. He says for the poor saints in Judea. But you know what I think? I think when he gets this big pot of money together, he's going to do what? Well, he may slip in and pull some out for himself, right? Paul says, I don't want your stuff. I don't want your money. For I do not seek yours, but who? You. I am more concerned about your soul than I am your stuff. For the children ought not to lay up for the parents, but the parents for the children. Paul was their father in Christ. He was the one that converted them. He's the one that established this congregation. He had been like a father to them, spiritually speaking. And, you know, if you accuse somebody of, he didn't take money the first time around, he wouldn't take pay, but now he's getting this big collection together, and when he gets it together, he's going to slip in there and get some of it. Yeah, that's pretty crafty, right? That's cunning. And that's what they're accusing him of, and he's being sarcastic here. Be that as it may, nevertheless, notice he says, being crafty. Well, that's what they were accusing him of. He's crafty. That's what they were doing, yeah. We've said this before, but if you watch enough political news and you listen to enough politicians or whoever, pundits in the news, people, and they accuse somebody of something else, generally speaking, it means what? That's what they're doing. And so more than likely, these guys were in it for the money as well, for themselves. And he says, look, this is not a ruse. If I love you more, am I to be loved less? I'm not dishonest. I'm not a charlatan. Literally, this word for crafty fellow in the Greek means a scoundrel. Did I take advantage of you by any of those I sent to you? You judge. I sent Titus. I sent another brother. And you, by the way, respected these men. Titus was respected by them. Did they ever take advantage of you? I mean, I'm the one that sent him. Y'all had a good relationship. Remember, go back to chapter 7, about verses 14 and 15. So, did they enrich themselves off of you? No. Well, was my behavior not consistent with theirs? Did Titus take advantage of you? Did we not walk in the same spirit? Did we not walk in the same steps? I'm the one that sent him. Y'all trusted him. You liked him. You had a good relationship, him and this other brother. Am I not behaving just like them? Well, it's becoming personal to him that these people have put him through all this after all he's done for them. Again, do you think that we excuse ourselves to you? Some translations say defend. All this time, you've been thinking that we are defending ourselves to you. We speak before God in Christ. Well, here he goes again, calling upon God as his witness, taking an oath. There's nothing wrong with oath taking. Paul does it about 3 or 4 times in the last 2 chapters. He said, God's my witness. And when he gets down to the end of it, what he's saying is, go back to 2 Corinthians 5:10. Who's going to judge my motives and my activities ultimately? I mean, that's the one I'm worried about. That's the one I have to. It's God. Well, we'll pick up a verse 19, next week.